to Grimsby in Lincolnshire now on BBC One Scotland. Question time with David Dimbleby.
The day after the budget, who are the winners and who are the losers? Our audience in Grimsby has their say as welcome to Question Time. And on our panel here in Grimsby, the Business Secretary Vince Cable, the Shadow Business Secretary Chuka Umunna, the former Shadow Home Secretary, Leadership Challenger David Davis, the Spectator columnist Melissa Kite, and the novelist Marina Lewycka, author of the brilliant comic novel A Short History of Tractors in Ukrainian. Our first question from Matthew Thompson, please.
With more than 1 in 6 people now aged over 60, isn't the government right to ask pensioners to pay their fair share?
Isn't the government right to ask pensioners to pay their fair share? Chuka Umunna.
Well, I think this was the big surprise in the budget, wasn't it? I mean, so much of it had been leaked beforehand, so of course people focused perhaps on those things that the government didn't really want people to know about, and that's the fact that they're taking about £83 a year from 4.4 million pensioners in the country from next year. I don't think this was the right thing to do, particularly when at the same time that they're doing this to the pensioners in this country, they are giving 14,000 millionaires a tax break in the order of £41,000. Look, I've got nothing against people who earn a lot of money and create wealth and jobs for our country, but in a context where people are really struggling with squeezed living standards, we've got 2.6 million people out of work, I'm not sure I would have made giving 14,000 millionaires that tax break a priority in the current context.
Vince Cable, what's the argument for freezing the tax allowances of the pensioner, as Matthew Thompson says, getting them to pay their fair share? Is that what you were after?
Not at all. 5 million pensioners, the majority, of course, don't pay tax at all, and most of them are poor people. And the key theme of the budget was actually giving them a substantial increase in the basic state pension, more than I think they've ever had. To take the last 2 years of this government, they will get, I think, £10 a week for a single person, and that far, far outweighs the extra costs to a minority of pensioners of the freezing of the allowance. Of course, nobody's been asked to pay more tax, it's just the allowance is being frozen, and depending on the rate of inflation, which is currently low and falling, they will not have to pay any more.
That's weasel words.
It isn't weasel
Well, hang on. If you have an allowance and people expect the allowance as normal to go on up with inflation, you suddenly say it's not going to. You can't then say you're not taking more money off them. You're taking money off them they wouldn't have expected.
If there is inflation, they would pay a little more.
Well, is there not going to be inflation?
Well, let's go back to your basic question. There are elderly people, actually people sort of late middle age, people of my generation, who do very well, actually, who've got good post-retirement income and are asset-rich, and it's right that they should pay more. The people who we're worried about, the people who've been affected by this particular proposal, are people on fairly low incomes, who've got a small superannuation, for example, and we do not want them to be hurt. They will actually benefit considerably overall from the budget because of the big increase in the state pension. Far outweigh any losses they feel here. I think looking 2012-2013, the gains to pensioners as a whole from improving the state pension, something this government's done, it's protected it, are 5 times more important than the losses that have been experienced with this group. But the big story in the budget was actually about lifting the allowances for 20 million people, low and middle income. That's what was where most of the money in the budget's gone. It's something my party fought for, and it will do a great deal to help ordinary people. £220 a year extra in tax cuts, and it will particularly help low-paid workers.
Marina Lewycka.
Pensioners are of that generation that they do want to pay their fair share. And so the question is really, what is fair? What is the fair share for pensioners? And I think what's particularly unfair about this tax, this sort of little theft of people's money, is that it actually comes not from the well-off pensioners. I mean, actually, I checked. I'm not affected because I earn too much. It's people who have got that little bit extra who are going to be squeezed by this. So they're the people who've worked, who've saved, who've done all the right things, who've tried to contribute. And actually, I don't think it's fair.
David Davis.
I came at this a slightly different approach. I take the view, generally with economic policy, that pensioners are in a unique position. They aren't able to change much about their circumstances. The rest of us still in work can do something, earn overtime, change the job maybe, but pensioners can't. So I was a little nervous when I heard this proposal come out, as it were, at the end of the budget. So I had a look at it. Thinking it wouldn't be a good idea if they lost by it. And actually what the numbers show is that if you take the whole package, not just one piece of it, as Chuka was trying to do, but the whole package, the pension, the state pension, with its so-called, this horrible phrase, triple lock, which we've borrowed from Gordon Brown. What that means is you either get the higher of 2.5% or earnings or inflation increase, the highest of those three. And you look at that against the freezing of the pension. The pensioner ends up roughly, the worst off pensioner ends up £67 a year, better off, not very much, better off than they would have been under Labour policy. So the answer is they don't have to take something which is worse than was reasonable. So I think it's a reasonable policy. It did worry me when I first heard it because of the issue of pensioners not having many options, but I think it works.
OK. We'll hear from one of the members of our audience here, up there on the far left. You, sir.
I think the biggest issue for me is that this budget, unfortunately, has done very little to address the massive gap in our society, which is very divisive, between the average people and the small top end who earn vast amounts of money, vast multiples of what the average person earns. And that is extremely divisive society. And quite frankly, I think it's morally indefensible and actually, quite frankly, repugnant that that's the case.
We'll come on to that in just a moment. Thank you. The man at the back there with the beard. You, sir.
Thank you. I'm concerned about whinging pensioners. The people we're talking about, the age group we're talking about, people who've benefited from free university education, tax relief on their mortgages when they were younger, NHS when we had one. I think they can afford to pay a bit back because it's our grandchildren who'll be paying for our mistakes in the future.
So you're in favour of what the questioner said? Then?
Yeah.
Yes. Melissa Kite.
I agree with the last speaker. I think he makes a very, very good point. I can totally understand why people are very upset about this because it was massively mishandled by George Osborne. I've heard of rabbits out of hats in budgets, but this was a sort of hound from hell out of a hat. It was not explained and it just was dropped as a sort of bombshell. And as David says, when you actually look at the whole thing together, it's not as bad. But there's been a lot of Labour scaremongering about it as well. We're talking about £60 to £200, basically, that earning pensioners with an income are going to lose. But just to pick up on that point, yes, today's pensioners have had chances and opportunities that I'm afraid a generation coming up now will never have. They had the free university education, they had soaring house prices, and they had final salary pension schemes and so on.
So now they can help pay for it?
Well, they can pay a little bit, but the point I'm trying to make is that we have to do something for society as a whole and to get society, to get Britain moving again, because this generation of young people coming up are just not going to have these chances.
All right. We'll move on to that in a moment. The woman in white in the back row.
To me, it seems just another way of eroding my standard of living in retirement. I work in the public sector. I was expecting to be able to retire from my job at 60. I've been told now that my pension will actually be consumer price linked instead of inflation linked. In the past 3 years, I've been told that I can't get my state pension at 60. It was going to be 63. Now I've just recently had a letter and told it's 65 years, 3 months. And I just feel that the money I'm trying to make up that shortfall now is also being eroded because the amount of interest I'm getting in the bank is almost negative. Yeah. And I just feel that at the moment, I'm just really quite dreading my retirement. Can I actually afford to retire?
Vince Cable, do you want to just answer that point?
Well, I do acknowledge that an awful lot of people feel squeezed. It has to be seen in the context of the massive crisis that we've just been through. The country as a whole is actually 10% worse off than before we had this massive financial crisis. We're trying to get back onto track and share the burden as fairly as possible. The reason why interest rates are very low is basically to stop the economy collapsing. The last government brought in very, very low interest rates through the central bank. We've had to maintain that. It does make it very hard for small savers. I fully understand that. But, you know, it's more important that we help the economy to recover from the terrible economic heart attack that it suffered, because that's what we've been through.
Let's stick with the budget, but from a different angle. Sheldon Ellis, please.
Does cutting the 50p tax rate to 45p signal the end of us all being in it together?
It was introduced by Labour, but Labour apparently are not prepared to say that they will bring it back in 2015 if they're re-elected. Is that right?
Look, if there was a general election tomorrow...
There isn't going to be one,
and we won,
yeah.
We would reverse
what
it.
About 2015?
We will be voting against it when it comes before the House of Commons shortly. I'm not going to write a manifesto for 2015 now or start to spell out all our different tax and spending measures. But let me say this, David.
Why not promise it? If you believe that it should be at 50 pence, which is what your leader said, it's not a spending. It's the government gets the money. You can give it away to the pensioners or poorer people. You could do something with it. You don't have to commit your...
Like I said, there's a balance of tax and spending measures that you spell out at the time of a general election before you expect to take government. But look, the principle that I think everybody here will agree with is that when you're going through these tough economic times, those with the broadest shoulders should bear the heaviest burden. And this measure, cutting it from 50 to 45p, runs completely counter to that. And that is the problem that I think people will have with this. 300,000 people are going to get a big tax break who are earning 6 times the average salary at a time when we've got 2.6 million people out of work, including, tragically, 1 million young people, at a time when people who are in work are facing the biggest squeeze on living standards in a generation, and when actually, for your average family, it's very, very difficult. Are these really the group of people who should we be prioritising in that context? I don't think so.
David Davis. You said you were uneasy about the other change when you heard it. Were you in favour of this one?
I'm not uneasy about this one. Look,
you are.
This is an astonishing piece of hypocrisy by the Labour Party. For 13 years, this idea that those with the broadest shoulders should carry the biggest burden is not new. It's been a part of British political life for my entire lifetime. And for the last 13 years of Labour government, Gordon Brown, first as Chancellor, then as Prime Minister, never thought it worthwhile moving the rate from 40p. He said in private to people he thought that was the level at which you got the most out of the rich, which is the key point. You've got to decide, are you just trying to punish the rich, or are you trying to get the most from them? If you're trying to get the most from them, then what we learned before with the Geoffrey Howe and the Lawson budgets is actually the maximum rate, 83% and 60%, didn't get the most. When they cut them from 83 down to 40, eventually we ended up double, triple the amount of money coming from the rich. Why? Because they stopped trying to avoid paying tax, they stopped leaving the country, they did different things to earn money, and that's what we need to do. We're in an economy now that needs, really, in my view, a sort of shock and awe to get us into a growth phase. I've got a son in his 20s, his generation, having real trouble getting jobs this last 5 years, real trouble, and we've got to put that right. And the way we put it right is to make sure we run the economy in the most sensible way, not the most political way, which we've had for the last 13 years.
George Osborne blamed the revenue that was coming in from the tax on the 50p rate as not being sufficient. There were a lot of avoidance issues. Surely we should be putting a lot more effort into recovering the tax that isn't being paid.
He's doing that. To be fair to him, he's doing that. And in fact, I agree with that. I think that, for example, this idea that you could buy an expensive house using a foreign corporation, avoid both capital gains and other taxes, is a dreadful idea and should have been shut down, and he has shut it down. And that's going to give us, I think, about £750 million. Well worth having.
The person there in the 1, 2, 3... Yes.
I don't understand how you can say that by lowering it, they won't try to avoid it, because they're going to try and avoid it, whatever it is. That's why they're so rich right now anyway.
Well, so the rich will always go on avoiding.
Yeah, always.
Melissa Kite, do you agree with that? The people will go on avoiding? There was a theory that they'd stop avoiding if you lowered the rate.
Well, they're certainly avoiding it now. They've been avoiding it at 50 pence. It's always amusing to listen to Labour talking about how putting taxes up is going to work. It never has worked in the past. And they've tried it at 80 and 60% and so on, and every time the revenues from taxation fell. So I think that the point is we have to find a way to make the wealthy people stay and pay. And 50p just isn't doing it. It hasn't worked.
Okay.
Well, it hasn't. I mean, it raised something like £100 million. It's not going to help.
All right, hold on a second. Vince Cable, you've got form on this, because you said at the party conference, some believe if taxes on the wealthy are cut, new revenue will miraculously appear. Pull the other one.
Yes. Well,
is that still your view?
No, I'm very firmly of the view that at a time of hardship, the wealthiest people in society should pay their share. And the question is...
So you're against this cut?
The question, no, I'm not against it. It certainly isn't my priority, or my party's priority, but
sorry, do you mean you have to grin and bear it when the Chancellor does it? I mean, I know you have a coalition...
No, I've defended it on economic grounds because, and this goes back to David Davis's point, if you want the wealthiest people in society to pay their share, you've got to find a way of doing it where they actually pay. And this particular gimmick, which was dreamt up actually 57 days before the end of the last Labour government, after 13 years, it didn't work. It didn't bring in very much money.
So why were you
what we are now doing
doing
is replacing it with much more effective measures, taxation on very valuable property, greatly limiting the allowances which the wealthiest people in society can stay, and putting a lot more effort into genuine tax avoidance to catch the tax dodgers. That's where the priority
This is ludicrous nonsense. The loophole that they're clamping down on in respect to properties worth £2 million or more, there are about 4,000 of those properties sold in the last year, whereas there are 300,000 very reasonably wealthy people who are going to be benefiting from this measure. And this notion that you don't do this out of envy, you do it because obviously we have grave issues to deal with, we need to reduce our debts, and therefore you get those who can afford to contribute more, to contribute a bit more for a period. And this, but it's not true to say it wasn't working, because actually what the government has done here, by abolishing it, it's going to lead to an upfront cost of £2.9 billion.
No, it isn't.
Now, if you let me finish, it comes to 100 million, it comes to 100 million, predicated on a massive assumption, and that is that wealthy people will change their behaviour and suddenly, miraculously, decide to pay more tax. And that's how you get to the 100 million figure.
Well, that's what the Inland Revenue says, not the government. It's HMRC that says that, isn't it?
Yes, but the OBR, if you let me finish, the Office for Budget Responsibility said that it's very uncertain because you can't actually make a proper evaluation. And they've only allowed a year to see what it brings in, when actually the Institute for Fiscal Studies has said you should allow this tax to be in place for a longer period if you want to get a better idea of how much it can raise. Is it really so unreasonable to expect people on 6 times the average salary during these difficult economic times just to contribute a bit more to help us through it?
Chuka, what happened the last time that the rate was dropped from 60 to 40% under Lawson?
But this isn't a 60-40% rate drop. This is a 50% rate drop. And actually, I mean, Melissa said in respect of...
You don't want to say it, but the answer is the take went up.
But that was 6... But that was... But hang on just a minute.
All right, no, you hang on. We've heard your point, Chuka. I want to hear from the audience. The woman there with brown hair, yes.
I'm an education student, so I'm in and out of schools a lot of time, and I'm talking to young people, and they think they've got such an unfair deal, and they have coming up. They're going to be paying higher tuition fees. A lot of them who work part-time, their minimum wage hasn't gone up this week, and yet at the same time they go home, they watch the 6 o'clock news, and millionaires have a tax cut. They really feel that they're being put on a lot of pressure to make up this budget deficit that they never caused, and I think it's just so unfair.
Marina Lewycka, do you think it will stimulate the economy by people coming back to this country, as some say, and benefit the revenue by people paying tax they wouldn't otherwise have paid?
I really don't know. I think it's a bizarre argument that somehow, because you know, people who are obviously in some sense fiddling the 50% tax are going to suddenly stop fiddling because it's gone down to 40%, 45%. It just seems odd to me. I just don't think people are like that.
You, sir. Yes.
Yeah, the only way that you're going to do it is the same as seatbelts. The law, bring in the law, tax avoidance law. That's the only way that you'll do it. If you bring in a tax avoidance law, general for everybody, then these people will stop avoiding, including Tony Blair, by the way, they'll stop avoiding the tax that they should be paying.
David Davis, do you think it should be 40 pence instead of
I would have
45?
If it had been me.
What?
I would have, if it had been me, gone from 50 to 40, yes, but that's...
would you like to have seen it go to 40?
I wouldn't have advocated it, but if it could be cut to 40, providing...
It's a funny way of talking.
Providing...
It's not my priority.
Let me answer your question. Providing it was replaced by a proper tax on wealth.
Which there hasn't yet been.
Which there hasn't been.
What happened to your mansion tax?
Well, there is a small mansion tax in the budget, but it's establishing... It's establishing a
Where's your
system.
mansion tax?
Well, there is going to be a levy on very large mansions that are registered in companies, which is a useful step.
But that's an anti-tax avoidance. That is an anti-tax avoidance measure.
Yeah.
Is making sure that you actually collect the tax. The levy exists there already to do.
Vince Cable, you said, and in The Guardian, just in the autumn here, clearly understood there's a trade-off. People understood what you said. If my colleagues will buy the idea of a mansion tax or some variation of that tax, and I hope they will, well, then we can look at the 50 pence rate. If they're not willing to look at it, the 50 pence rate stays.
Well, that's what...
Why aren't you quitting this government?
Well, because there has been a very good trade-off. There has been... Two things have happened in this budget. Instead of having the 50p rate, which brought in very little money, we now have much more effective taxation of wealth and very high income. And in addition...
But it's your job.
And in addition, the most important part of the budget is that 20 million plus ordinary taxpayers have got a very, very substantial tax cut as a result of raising the allowance. That's something I and my party fought for. It is the centrepiece of the budget. It's where most of the money has gone. And as a consequence of it, everybody, 20 million taxpayers, get a reduction of £220. And that is what the budget is essentially about. It is right also that we tackle extreme wealth and income, and that's what we're doing in a more effective way than was existing before.
Even that is so telling, that phrase, extreme wealth. I mean, this is about sort of wealth as a dirty word, almost. I think, this budget was trying to send out a signal that we are not going to tax success, that we are not going to hunt down people who have done well. It's
everybody else.
But this is about wealth creation as well.
OK. I'm going to have one or two members of our audience. Let me just go to another question. Yes,
yeah,
you, sir.
Surely Labour should celebrate the fact that the Chancellor, a man with great integrity, has had the moral courage to lift people out of poverty by increasing the tax threshold to £9,000 a year.
OK, so they should be celebrating what Osborne's done. And you say in the third row from the back.
With people avoiding tax, 320 members of the BBC, on over £50,000 a year, have all just avoided paying tax, and that was in the admin. So it seems that everyone these days is able to avoid paying tax if you earn a certain amount of money.
320 members of the BBC?
Yeah.
Where'd you get that one from?
That's off of the web and that, and it's been brought up in the Information Act.
Oh, really?
Last couple of days. Just thought, I hope you're not one of them.
No, I'm not. I'm not a member of the BBC. I just work for them.
That's a very narrow answer, David.
The politician's answer.
And you sat there.
The interesting thing is, if you look at France, for example, one of their left-wing candidates is looking at introducing a super tax, which is something like 65–75%, because they do believe that those who can afford more money pay the biggest load. Indeed, Warren Buffett, one of the multi-millionaires, said he wanted to pay more tax, and what this budget's actually done is rewarded the front bench team, most of which are millionaires, and allowing them to skip more tax. Now, what I should say is that we need to be looking at those who can't afford it and making sure that they don't have to suffer. So more needs to be done. It's absolutely ridiculous.
Okay. Just before we leave the point, Vince Cable, is your argument for the cut in the tax to do with the amount of tax it raises, or is it to do with encouraging enterprise?
Well, both are relevant, but
then?
both are relevant. If it encourages enterprise, that's good. But the primary objective of the treatment of the tax at the top was that the 50p rate was completely ineffectual, did not raise very much money, and there are much better, more sensible ways of taxing wealth and very high income.
All right, let's move on to a completely different subject. We go to Holly Brown, please, for this question. Holly Brown.
Why did the British woman kidnapped in Somalia have to finance her own freedom? Why did the government not do more?
Judith Tebbit, who was released yesterday, having apparently her family had to pay, it's reported, something just under £1 million, £800,000 to the pirates who took her. Why didn't the government do more? Melissa Kite.
Clearly, the government couldn't do more, because if they did pay the ransom, then more people would be kidnapped. And that is an agonising position to be in. And all I can say is I just totally understand why they did absolutely everything they could to pay it themselves. And I would have done the same. And I would have done the same knowing that probably by doing that I had stored up future kidnaps. And that just is an agonising position.
David Davis.
Ransoms are a bad idea, generally. I actually ran a hostage rescue operation right back in the 90s, and we spent a great deal of time trying to prevent the family of the victim paying a ransom, precisely because it would encourage, it was in Colombia, it would encourage more people to be kidnapped. There were 75 Americans held at that time in Colombia, partly because it was a trade that was done there. And we resolved it militarily. I'm afraid, I feel great pain, agony, really, for the families involved in this. But when you pay ransom, you get one person back and hold up the prospect of another 10 being kidnapped later. And I'm afraid it's the wrong way to do it. I'm afraid the only answer to kidnap is to rescue the people, get them back, using military force if necessary, using negotiation if you can. Never pay ransoms.
The government, I think this is correct, makes it a criminal offence to pay terrorists a ransom. In other words, if it had been Al-Qaeda or Al-Shabaab who'd actually been proven to have held Mrs. Tebbit, the Foreign Office could have banned the payment. Do you think they should extend that to saying no ransoms under any circumstances will be paid? Is that what you're arguing?
I think you should. I mean,
criminally prosecute the family?
No, I think we just try and prevent it. I mean, what happened? I mean, I can just talk from my own example. I mean, what happened there was we just simply made it difficult to, for it to be paid.
Was this when you were in the SAS?
No, it was in the Foreign Office.
Oh, you were in the Foreign Office, good.
But the simple truth was we could resolve it another way, but by rescue. But I do think it's really, really problematic. I know it's difficult. It's impossible, really, for the parents or relatives or even friends of the individuals who have been kidnapped. For them, it's an impossible circumstance. But the government really has to take a hard line.
Man up there in the white shirt on the corner there, yes.
Surely a point that needs to be considered, though, is that people really need to take more responsibility for what it is. It's not like people don't know the situation out near Somalia, and you really should take look and not go into an area that's a hotbed of pirate activity and then expect the government to pick up the pieces if you get kidnapped.
Yes. It's fair to say there had been no onshore kidnappings from Kenya, which is where this happened. Chuka Umunna.
I'm not sure I quite agree with the last point because, for example, I'm part Nigerian and I hope to go back to Nigeria sometime soon, and it's not necessarily always seen as the safest place, and there are kidnappings that happen there. And of course, we had a really tragic incident as a country where I think a couple of lives were lost in a rescue attempt in Nigeria. Now, does that mean, because of what you've said, sir, that I shouldn't seek to go and see my family over there because of the risk involved? I'm not so sure.
What do you think about the issue
I'm not
that
so
was
sure
raised,
of that. Well, in relation to, I do think that the government does have to take a hard line on it. notwithstanding that, I would say that, look, I mean, I think I wouldn't necessarily encourage people to do it, but if a member of my family were in that situation, I'm damn sure that I would try and find all the resources necessary to pay that ransom to free them. But it's not something that I think I would encourage, because, of course, that would encourage, that would encourage more kidnapping.
But you make a distinction between what you would do and what society as a whole should do, or government as a whole should do.
I think so. Look,
it doesn't mean anything, does it? Because if the principle is not to do it, and you say if it happened you would do it, which I'm sure many people would.
Well, I'm saying, I mean, I think, well, there's a question as to whether government actually makes the payment or whether the family should. And I suppose, I just think it would be disingenuous of me to sit here and to just give a lie and pretend that actually, if it happened in my family, the emotion of it and the attachment wouldn't overcome you, because I think it would. I think it would.
There was a case in Somalia of the Chandlers who there was a ransom paid. Yeah. And who knows that didn't encourage this particular operation.
Yeah, I agree with that. I agree with that.
Although I agree with David's point of view, I think that if all avenues have been exhausted, human life is more important than money. So if everything has been exhausted, every single option, you can't just leave someone there to be killed. I do agree with what you've said.
So you're saying you'd pay the ransom?
If every single avenue has been exhausted, I mean, human life is more important than money. You can't put a value on it. So that's my view.
I was going to say, unfortunately, it's not just a problem of human life or money. It's a problem of human life now as against possibly more human life in the future. That's what makes it so difficult.
It's difficult.
And it makes these things are terrifying because there's no right answer. We become aware of how vulnerable we are.
Vince Cable.
I think the distinction Chuka made between the role of the government and the individual is a very important one, actually. I mean, I don't think we can possibly say that as a matter of government policy we will pay up ransom. I mean, kidnapping would just go completely out of control and it would be a massive incentive for people to do it. But in an individual circumstance, particularly a very tragic one like this, I think the husband was killed in the first raid. And, the family, this is what they want to do. I don't think we can prohibit them from doing it. As I think David did at the beginning, in the case of terrorist organisations, I think we have to be very careful, and payment to terrorist organisations is a crime. But I think if an individual family is caught up with a criminal gang like that, I think one has to understand their situation and their pressures, and certainly it's not, I don't think it's our job to stop them doing it.
There must be a way of pretending to take money and, getting in the situation where you're in contact with these people and then
deceiving them.
That
won't work second time round, will it? The person in the second row at the back.
Given the comments that have been made, what does this actually say about our government? We've had our foreign minister saying that Somalia and Sudan are failed states. We've had the pirating going on in the seas. What action should our officers be taking in respect of the diplomatic mission and the aid we give these countries in order to ensure that their people don't do this to us?
Well, a brief answer, David Davis, if you would.
What should we do? Well, there's a limit to what you can do. I mean, Somalia is an enormous place, and it's been in turmoil for, I can't remember how many decades now, but certainly a couple of decades. And you cannot go into every lawless part of the world and pacify them, otherwise we end up with a whole series of other problems. You just have to respond to the circumstance when it arises, and in my view we should respond forcefully. Those countries that have responded forcefully have been effective. When we responded forcefully in Colombia, there were no more Brits kidnapped for a significant time afterwards. That's all you can do.
Do you think that was considered by this government?
I'm sure they would have considered it, yes.
But rejected?
Well, there's a practical issue, whether you can find them, whether you know where they are, whether it's safe. You've got the Nigerian circumstance where we went in and the 2 hostages died in the course of the raid. You've got to take all those on board and then make a judgment accordingly.
We'll move on to another question, but if you want to join in the debate, on Twitter, remember our hashtag, I'm sure you know it, BBCQT. Text us 83981, push the red button, or look at CFAX, page 155, to see what others are saying. Georgina Harris has the next question. Georgina Harris, please.
Should teachers in Grimsby be paid less for doing the same job as their counterparts in the south of England?
So this goes to the heart of what... This goes to the heart of what the Chancellor announced, that the government is looking to see if public sector pay can be made more responsive to local pay. In other words, if public sector pay should be locally negotiated. Chuka Umunna, you wanted local benefits made different region by region. Do you think that these teachers, for instance, in Grimsby should be paid less because living costs in Grimsby are less?
Well, I mean, perhaps if I just read out a quote from a well-known cabinet minister, it would cause all kinds of problems if you had differential pay within the public sector. You would have people looking for promotion in one part of the country and not working together.
I was looking for your opinion, around. Not Vince Cable's.
I actually happen to agree with Vince Cable on this one.
All right. Vince?
Well, I think we certainly have to be very careful. I mean, maybe actually there's an argument for having higher teachers pay in Grimsby if there's a shortage of teachers in Grimsby. I mean, that is the common sense point. I mean, what the government's looking at, and I just want to stress this is a very preliminary look. This is not imposing a policy. It's that there are one or two models already in the court service the last Labour government introduced, where pay is set locally, reflecting local conditions, and it could be there's a shortage of staff, it could be that housing costs differ from one place to another, and there is an argument for extending that. But I you know, for the reasons that Chuka has just quoted, I think imposing regional variations in pay would be completely wrong, and it wouldn't work. And that's not what
you're looking at it. Why are you looking at it?
You just said that if there were a shortage of teachers in Grimsby, there might be an argument for paying more.
Allowing more flexibility.
So are you suggesting kind of that there should actually be a regional marketplace for nurses and teachers, where you'd say, well, in Liverpool, we've got a shortage. You could
allow more variation.
Would you like to see
that? Well, it would probably make sense, and we already do that. I mean, if you're in London, you have London waiting, for example. You know, these differences are already there. But it's building on it in a sensible way. We certainly don't want to be in a position where in sort of relatively low-income parts of the country, pay is then depressed. I mean, that would be wrong and inappropriate. But there may be areas where the shortage of labour in some areas, housing costs vary enormously. Let's have a bit more flexibility in the system, as we've already seen in one or two areas like the court service.
You quoted him. Do you agree with him?
Well, I just think he's been rather contradictory. On the one hand, he seems to say that he doesn't want differential pay in the public sector. On the other hand, he does.
Impose it.
So I'm kind of I'm slightly confused by the message that he's giving. It's actually also at variance with what other ministers are saying.
David Davis.
I'm just sitting here thinking, you know, that Chuka's saying this, and as we've heard, Labour introduced this exact thing for the court service. They also changed quite dramatically the London waiting for the police in the last. Well, let me just finish the point, Chuka. I don't want to pick a row. The simple problem we have here is that when a part of the country has high unemployment, the government quite properly is prone to move public sector work there. Happened particularly in the northeast of England, where my family come from, and other parts of and Wales and other parts of the country. Then what happens, of course, in Wales, the people doing exactly the same job in the public sector end up being paid 18–20% more than they would in the private sector. Then it becomes really difficult for anybody to start a company in that part of the world because they can't get the staff. So the unemployment gets worse. We have to solve this problem. We haven't decided exactly how to do it, but we're going to look at these options, and it may well be different for teachers and nurses than for ordinary administrative staff or whatever.
So you're saying wherever there's high unemployment, there are low private sector wages?
Not always,
relatively.
not always, but sometimes if you've got, naturally, I mean, the northeast of England, where I say where my family came from, huge industrial tradition, huge tradition of energy and enterprise there in the past. What would normally have happened is that because labour's cheap, people have gone back there and reinvested there. Didn't happen because of the effect of very large public sector employment. So we have to find a solution. We can't just live with long-term unemployment in some parts of the country.
So if you cut, the question from Georgina Harris, if you cut the pay of teachers in Grimsby, are you saying that would help the private sector?
What I actually said in the middle of what I was saying, David, is that you probably have a different answer for teachers where there's more of an argument for a national scale than for other more general skills.
The woman here in the front row.
Is it a coincidence that a Conservative government are looking at legislation or changing the bargaining power of teachers that would undermine the power of teaching unions?
Marina, Lewycka, you've been in the teaching trade or profession. What do you make of that point?
Well, I'll come back to on the point of regional pay, because what I think is that in places like Grimsby or Sheffield, where I live, the public sector, including teachers, form a sort of possibly a disproportionately large part of the workforce. And the fact that the teachers' wages are higher than the average wage actually raises the overall income of the community. And, you know, having that money coming into the community means that local businesses, shops can stay open that would shut otherwise, you know, cafes and restaurants stay open. There's a little bit more spending power in the community. And if you actually lower the public sector wages, then I don't think it creates, I think there's no evidence that it creates jobs in the private sector. I think what it does is actually drag down the whole economy.
Woman in the back row there, in red.
I agree that the cost of living here is cheaper than it would be in the south, but there's other issues other than just the cost of living. If we want to buy alcohol, for instance, it's a long way to go down to the Channel to cross, and obviously more expensive for us. Also, to go on holiday, regional airports charge more than they do in the south.
So it wouldn't be fair, in your view?
No, I don't think it would be.
And the woman here in the third row in blue, what do you think?
I think you want to make sure that you get decent teachers across the country. We all train the same way. We know we're going to the profession because we're keen. We want to make sure that our children are well educated. And I think to start to vary the pay could actually affect the amount of people actually go into the profession and cause socio-economic problems because you get certain people moving to certain areas to do the jobs, and it would mean that certain areas would lose out, and maybe the teaching in that area would become worse as a result. So it would be a problem.
Vince, can you answer that point? Would you like to see teachers taken out of this study that the government's doing?
No, I mean, this already happens. I mean, if there are scarcity subjects, for example, and teachers are paid more, and the idea that, you know, there may be parts of the country, I don't know what the position's like in Grimsby, where there may be a chronic shortage of teachers, there may be a great surplus, and surely the pay system should reflect that in some degree. And that's all we're talking about. Well, I don't know the position in Grimsby, but if it is, you know, surely there is some common sense in allowing the, you know, local conditions to be reflected.
Melissa Kite.
Well, I think this does point up the differences between the life in the public and the private sector. If you work in the private sector, it's a sort of given that if you want to earn the big wages, you know, you gravitate towards the areas where the big wages are being paid. I grew up in the Midlands, and a lot of us decided that we had to go to London to earn more money. I mean, that just is life in the private sector, and part of me thinks, well, you know, it's you know, protecting people in the public sector from that is sort of not living in the real world. But I do think there are precious few perks at the minute to working in the public sector, and therefore if this is one of them, and if the security of knowing that wherever you work you will be paid a certain rate keeps good teachers and so on in the professions, then I think it's probably better to keep it that way.
All right. Woman in purple. Yes.
I just think regional variation in pay just creates more of a north-south divide. And also, particularly for, say, young graduates or whatever, if they settle in one part of the country, then they become trapped and they can't afford to move for that very reason, because there's more of a divide throughout the country.
Let's go on to another question. George Wilson, please. George Wilson.
Is this year a good time for the UK to consider becoming a republic?
Dare I ask your view?
Well, I'd certainly give you my view. I think the Queen's doing a pretty good job. I've been perturbed for a long time about the family. They seem to be improving a bit. And when you consider the alternative, God help us, we might have President Blair or President Prescott.
Okay. So the question, Marina Lewycka, is this year, the Jubilee, the Queen's Jubilee year, a good time for the UK to consider becoming a republic?
Not this year, I think. I think the Queen's doing a pretty good job. And in a way, you know, when you think of all the things she has to put up with and all the travelling around, I actually feel a little bit sorry for her. She has to put up with living with Prince Philip. She has to be smiling all the time when she probably feels jolly cross about something. I think definitely not this year. Possibly when the Queen is ready to retire or, you know, passes away, then that might be the time to consider becoming a republic.
Would you like Britain to be a republic?
Yes.
Melissa Kite.
I think the Queen is such terrific value for money. I can't actually think of anything else that is as good value for money as the Queen. I was having this argument... We don't get much for our money nowadays, but I was having this argument with someone the other day. I think I looked it up at the time on my BlackBerry, and it was something like 50 pence per person a year or something. What do we get for that? This is fantastic. You know, I mean, the tourists that come, the fact that there are every day outside Buckingham Palace, you know, crowds waiting to see the changing of the guard, or what, you know, I mean, just. It is fantastic value for money.
So it's commercial judgment for you, whether we're a republic or a monarchy?
Well, it's a bit of heart as well as head for me. But I do think even, you know, even if you don't like the idea of a monarchy, you have to see that it gives us such a fabulous identity and it makes us a bit special and a magnet for tourists.
All right. Man up there in the spectacles, and I come to you. Yes.
I think the general public have had enough of politicians. There's far too many of them around, and the last thing we want are more failed politicians as head of state. Far better to have someone that considers duty before their own personal advancement.
You want monarchical rule, really?
You could say that.
What? You could?
You could.
You'd like the Queen to rule rather than the politicians?
No, not really. As long as she's got our current role is quite satisfactory as far as I'm concerned.
Okay.
What about the next generation coming along? Do you feel the same about them?
Yes. That's what a monarchy system's all about. You don't elect them.
No.
The man in the beard here. Or with the beard. In a beard. Sounds like... Man in a beard makes sound if you put it on for the evening.
I wear it, you know.
Well, it makes him look like King George, anyway. So.
I'd have to say I agree with the lady here. You know, the Queen is perfect value for money. When I've been abroad, and I come from experience of working abroad and of travelling a lot, what I hear about is a lot of the time people drinking abroad, people fighting abroad. Well, you know what? Whenever they mention the Queen, it's always about what a great country we are, and I think it encourages A, growth, B, tourism. You know, I think it's all-round value for money. I think it's a great investment.
Well, I'm not a Republican, and I think there's this old saying, isn't there, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. And, you know, the monarchy works perfectly well. It performs, the Queen admirably performs the function of head of state, is popular, respected overseas. I actually, although I am a politician, I actually rather agree with the gentleman at the back. We should stick to what we're supposed to do and do it properly and let the monarch get on with her job, which she does very well.
Chuka Umunna.
I actually met the Queen for the first time this week, and I tweeted after.
What's that got to do with it?
I was just going to say, what I was going to say is I tweeted afterwards and said I thought she's done a superb job, and got showered with abuse on Twitter. But I do think she's done a superb job, and I kind of, the way I describe myself is a default monarchist, because I don't agree with the hereditary principle, but I can't think what else would be better, you know, to put in its place. And at the end of the day, is everybody knows the Queen. If you Google the Queen, our Queen comes up. I think she's a fantastic asset, and if anything, really puts us on the map. And I was just thinking the other day, the President of Germany stepped down the other day. I don't even know whether a new one has been appointed, and I doubt anybody knows the name of the last German president. But everybody knows who our Queen is, and I'm with the rest of the panel really on this. Although we haven't heard from you yet, David. Maybe you're a shock Republican.
Well, I'm sitting here smiling. I'm sitting here smiling at the idea of being asked about the hereditary principle by a Dimbleby.
We don't go back so far.
Yeah, not yet. Yeah. I travelled up actually on the train with El Presidente Prescott, and I'm very pleased to tell you his ambitions only extend to police commissioner at the moment. That's bad enough. I think the best comment on this actually came from a Labour Prime Minister, from Harold Wilson, who once said that one of the things that keeps Britain from becoming a dictatorship is having to go and kneel before the Queen once a week and explain your job to her. And I think that's a really, really wise insight. We are fabulously lucky in this country that the most powerful people have to bend the knee to somebody else. And that's what keeps us as civilised as we are. So long may she reign.
Okay. Are there any Republicans in our Grimsby audience that I can know? You are.
Marina, we've talked about how great value for money the Queen is, but I'm just wondering whether Prince Charles will have that same sort of international love drawing to him. And so I agree with Marina that perhaps this year's not ideal year to be questioning this, but when we start looking at the future heads of our state, will they have the same international value for money?
Right. Rob Connor, you have a question, and I think we've just got time to fit it in.
Yes, is David Cameron's idea to privatise the vast